very briefly, at the outset you discussed collecting for DNA testing for the blackout cartridges. Is that correct?
Collecting for the possible presence of touch DNA, yes.
Yes. And did you only test 2 of those cartridges?
All 7 were processed using the soaking method.
Okay. With that processing method, any results that you will receive, would they be specific to any one cartridge, or would it just be for the collection of all 7?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Would you have results for DNA from the way that you collected the sample for a specific shell case, or would it be for all 7 as a set?
Okay, I just want to clarify, I did say there were 7 cartridges, there were only 6. So although they are being individually soaked, they are being combined within that filtration unit, so the results would be from all of the cartridges together.
Okay. And you had positive presumptive tests for 2 shotguns, correct? Portions of 2 shotguns?
Do you have a item number that corresponds?
I can get those in a second. Do you remember there are 2 shotguns you just testified had positive presumptive blood tests? One was sled item number 15.
Yes, so the swabs from the Benelli shotgun, item 15, was positive for the possible presence of blood. However, I believe you mean the second set of swabs, item 16, that was negative.
And then there was later a sled item 22.
Oh yes, the 2 sets of swabs from sled item 22 were both positive for the possible presence of blood.
So I guess, what exactly is a presumptive test?
So a presumptive test is indicating the possible presence of a body fluid, in this case, blood. It's not confirming the presence, it's just an indication so that we can further test that stain.
And how does it indicate the possible presence of blood?
So the phenolphthalein test interacts with the hemoglobin found within blood, and that's what it's basically giving a positive result with.
Is it fair to say that it changes color? It's like a dye and it changes color?
So it's a color change test. Based on the presence of the hemoglobin, a swab that's being tested will turn a bright pink color.
And is that presumptive test specific to human blood?
It is not specifically human blood. It can be human blood or animal blood.
Could chemicals other than blood cause a positive test result?
So the phenolphthalein test has what we call false positives, which can give a positive result, but it is not blood. Those include copper salts, nickel salts, rust, as well as some plant and peroxidases, which include broccoli, cauliflower, horseradish. It also can give a positive result for pus and sometimes in the presence of bacteria.
Okay, so there are a number of things that could give a positive result. Is that why you also have a confirmatory test?
If we test something for the possible presence of blood, we don't typically do a confirmatory test unless it's requested. We just store that sample for DNA analysis.
Who would request a confirmatory test?
Usually an investigator of an agency may request it. Sometimes solicitors or defense attorneys may request an additional test.
And the confirmatory test, I think you testified, is just basically like a COVID test?
It works similar to a COVID test.
2 lines means human blood?
It'll have a line to indicate that the test is working properly, which is a control line. And then if it is positive, it will have an additional second line. If that second line does not show, that means that the test is negative.
Is it an accurate test?
I would say that it's an accurate test as long as the control line is present.
It's more accurate than the presumptive test. That's why you use it, correct?
So the confirmatory test is saying that yes, blood is identified on the item that's being tested.
Human blood.
Human blood, as well as higher primate blood and ferret blood.
And you did not do any confirmatory tests on the shotguns?
I did not do any confirmatory tests on the shotgun swabs.
And that was simply because no one asked you to, correct?
In effort to not consume any of the sample on the swabs, as a swab is a small area, we just forward it for DNA analysis.
But in the Chevy Suburban, you did perform a hemotrace test?
Yes, because that these swabs for the Chevy Suburban were already previously processed with another presumptive test by the crime scene unit, we could not presumptive test behind because our two tests work in a similar manner.
Whose decision was it to do the hemotrace test on the Chevy Suburban?
That is typically how we process items of evidence that we receive from the crime scene unit in the form of swabs based on any of their presumptive testing.
But like, who made the decision to do the hemotrace test on that steering wheel? The name of a person?
I perform the hemotrace test.
On your own initiative?
No, that is a common way we do testing on swabs that have already been collected based on a presumptive test.
Did someone instruct you to perform a hemotrace test on the steering wheel?
No, it is part of our general operating procedures.
But you did not perform hemotrace tests on the weapons?
The swabs that were collected off of the weapons, no, because they were not presumptively testing prior, so I could use our presumptive test on those items.
Did you perform or prepare any samples from the victim's clothing or bodies other than the fingernail clippings that you discussed?
I do not believe so.
Okay, so the only thing from the body of Maggie Murdaugh or Paul Murdaugh that you tested were the fingernail clippings from Maggie Murdaugh?
So I prepared the fingernail clippings for DNA analysis, as well as the buccal swabs from those individuals.
Right, but nothing else from their bodies, correct?
No, I did not test their
Or
clothing.
their clothing. Or their clothing, sorry.
I did not test their clothing.
When looking at the T-shirt that you just testified about, and those cuttings, I think you have opened a bag and the cuttings were there and you prepared them. Did you perform any serology tests on those cuttings?
No, I just removed those cuttings from the shirt as the result of the crime scene testing.
Are you aware of any serology tests being performed on those cuttings?
Of the shirt?
Yes, of those big shirt cuttings.
I believe there was further analysis performed on those cuttings.
Did somebody other than you later perform serology tests on those cuttings, to your knowledge?
It is my understanding that there was additional testing on those cuttings.
Serology testing?
Serology testing.
Specifically hemotrace?
I believe there was hemotrace performed on the cuttings from the shirt.
But that, just to be clear, that wasn't performed by you?
I did not perform hemotrace on any of the cuttings on the shirt.
Did you perform any hemotrace tests on the shorts or tennis shoes?
I did not perform any hemotrace testing on the shorts or the shoes.
Just, I guess, maybe a little bit of background to understand maybe who does what. When you're working on this case, do you have like a direct supervisor?
I do have a direct supervisor.
And who is that person?
Her name is Laura Hash.
And is she the person who directs your activities as regard to this case?
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance.
Objections overruled.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Is Lieutenant Laura Hash the person who would direct your activities with regards to this case?
So, based on our operating manual as well as my training experience, based on the requests of certain items that are submitted, I will decide how those are tested. However, if additional processing is requested, those usually are communicated to me through my direct supervisor.
And just for clarity, we've talked a bit about DNA, but you're just preparing samples and they go to someone else who does the analysis and reports. That's not you, correct?
That's correct. I am just preparing the samples for further analysis.
Is the only hemotrace test that you did for this case the steering wheel? Well, strike that. The Chevy Suburban, I believe there may have been some negative tests from the Suburban, but were those the only hemotrace tests you did for this case?
No, I did hemotrace the swabs from the Chevy Suburban. I also hemotrace tested swabs collected from a Ford F-250.
And what were the results from the Ford F-250?
There were 4 swabs submitted from the Ford F-250, and the results for all 4 of those sets of swabs were negative for human blood.
So the steering wheel was the only positive test that you did for hemotrace?
Yes, the steering wheel from the Chevy Suburban is the only positive hemotrace result I have.
Beg the court's indulgence. Just one final question or a little set of questions. It seems like sometimes the crime scene people or department, I shouldn't just say people, I guess they're a department, do presumptive blood tests. Is that correct?
Yes, it's my understanding that the crime scene unit does perform presumptive blood tests.
And the initials LCV have been used. I think you might have mentioned. What does that mean?
It stands for leucocrystalline violet.
And can you describe that test?
I don't know much about the test. I just know that it is a test that the crime scene unit uses as their presumptive blood test.
Do you know what color it turns when there's a positive result?
It'll turn a purple color.
So let me ask this. Why, we saw a picture of the shirt gridded out. You remember that exhibit?
I do.
Why was the presumptive test done? It was at the Slab Laboratory? Is that the location that was?
Are you asking about the LCV processing?
Yes, where was that test conducted?
That was done at the Sled Laboratory.
Why was that done by the crime scene unit and not the serology unit?
We do not use LCV testing, and I am unsure as to why that particular test was chosen to be used by the crime scene unit.
Because earlier, you did tests on the hem, right? The pheno tests on the front and back hem of the shirt, is that correct?
I did.
But then the crime scene unit later came back and in the lab did a different kind of test.
That is correct.
And you don't know why?
I was not part of that decision. I was just notified that they would be performing that test while I was retrieving the additional stain that I had tested earlier.
And finally, it seems like if something is tested presumptive in the field and comes to you, you do a confirmatory test. Is that what happened with the Chevy Suburban?
Yes, that's correct.
But if something comes to you and there's not been a presumptive test, like with the shotguns, then you don't perform a confirmatory test?
No, I do the presumptive test.
Do you know why that's the policy?
It's an effort to not consume as much sample on a swab. A swab is it's like a sterile Q-tip, so essentially the surface area is very small. So in efforts to not consume the sample and to give more for DNA analysis, that's what's done.
If something goes to DNA analysis and there's some result, does it ever come back for a blood test to see if the source of the DNA was blood?
To be phen tested?
No, for hemotrace test.
As I mentioned, hemotrace testing can be requested on the back end, as any of our CAR tests can be.
In your experience, I think we had some testimony about your experience. If DNA is found on something, is there ever then a time that you go back and say, hey, was the source of this DNA blood, and do a hemotrace test?
Hemotrace specifically, to my knowledge, no. But in my experience, there have been times that solicitors or defense attorneys will request a card test be done on a sample after the DNA analysis has been performed.
No further questions.
Any redirect?
None from the state, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down.